Well, hello, church history friends. My name's Barb Walden, and I am thrilled to welcome you to tonight's program. Tonight is extra special as it's the first lecture in our new autumn lecture series. So thank you for joining us tonight as we kick off another exciting series. Joining me this season are my co-hosts, Peter Smith and Wendy Eaton. Peter serves as a board member for the Historic Sites Foundation, and Wendy serves as the administrative assistant for the foundation. So welcome to Peter and Wendy. I'm so glad that you're here. Tonight's lecture, as I mentioned, kicks off our fall lecture season and another series of fascinating church history. I'm going to do a screen share to give you a sneak peek on what to expect this coming season. We have 5 presenters this season who will share their unique insight into Community of Christ history over the next couple of weeks. Together, we will learn about the politics in 1830s Kirtland with Seth Bryant. We'll learn about Nauvoo Polygamy and the RLDS Church tonight with Lachlan Mackay. We'll learn about the Whitmer family's influence on the early years of the church with Mark Staker. And we'll learn about the formation of the church in Nigeria in the 1960s and Cecil Ettinger's role in those early years. We'll learn that from David Ettinger, Cecil Ettinger's son. And lastly, we'll add one more storyteller in our Your Story is Church History series as we welcome Andrew Bolton to share his unique journey with us on November 20th. This is going to be a great series, and we hope you will join us. You can register for any of these lectures by heading over to the Foundation's website. And for some of you, especially good at attention to detail, you'll notice that the start time for Andrew Bolton's program is different from our traditional 7 p.m. Central start time. Andrew will be joining us virtually from Leicester, England, a location that is about 6 hours ahead of Central USA time. So considering Andrew is doing us a real favor by sharing his historic journey with us, we're not going to ask him to share his story at 1 in the morning or in the middle of the night. Instead, he'll be sharing at 7 p.m. his time in Leicester, England, which makes it 1 p.m. Central our time. So we hope you'll join us for that special program on November 20th. Of course, if you can't make it, not to worry, you can always catch the recording available on our YouTube channel. Friends, there is no way we could host these lectures without your generous support. Your donations for the fall lecture series go to developing new educational programs. They fund the Alma Blair Internship Program, a life-changing program for young adults. They support the expansion of oral histories. They sponsor our annual Church History Bus Tour and ensure that we can continue providing online programs like our lecture series and book series long into the future. You can see the QR code on the screen, and Wendy will drop the online donation link and mailing address into the chat. So thank you for your support, friends. We're excited to have Lachlan Mackay. Speaking of guest speakers and great lectures, we're excited to have Lach with us this evening to share his research on Nauvoo polygamy. Many of you know Lach. He's a familiar face and a familiar friend to the lecture series, but for anyone new in the crowd who's not familiar with Lach or the face that you see on the screen, it'll be my pleasure to introduce him. Lach Mackay is a past president of the John Whitmer Historical Association and now serves in Community of Christ Council of 12 Apostles, where he partners with Apostle Shannon McAdam to support the church in Australia, the Pacific Islands, Canada, the British Isles, Western Europe, and Eurasia. They also assist the First People, All Nations, and Plano Stone Church non-geographical congregations. Lach received a BA in Economics and Russian Area Studies from the University of Missouri, Columbia. His past publications have focused on Kirtland Temple, the Smith family properties in Nauvoo, and the visual image of Joseph Smith, including most recently extensive work on the Smith-Larson daguerreotype. Welcome, Lach. Your role with Community of Christ has changed a lot over this past year, as we can see from tonight's introduction. You've gone from being based at the historic sites in the US to a brand new base that is all over the world. And I've got to ask, in this new assignment, as you're exploring the world, are you picking up any new church history overseas, or are you experiencing any new to you historic sites that you can tell us about?
So I am. I was in Zambia not too long ago, and I had a chance to do church history with about 80 people from 10 African nations. And we spent time talking about the historic sites in the places where they are from, which is pretty exciting. It was an early conversation, talked a lot about what a historic site was, what might make something historic. And so I'm really excited about continuing those discussions. Um, I did just get back and probably still slightly jet lagged from a trip to the United Kingdom and Western Europe. And I had a chance to visit Preston in England for the first time, which is where the first baptisms in Europe took place. Andrew and Jewel Bolton were kind enough to take Shannon and I there. And it's kind of interesting that, unlike our members in the US, folks in Western Europe don't often, or the United Kingdom, connect as much or as quickly to those really early sites. They sometimes connect more to the 1860s sites. But it was really interesting to remember that, as many of you know from a previous lecture, that Ann Dawson was the first woman baptized in Europe whose descendants became RLDS in St. Louis. Um, and another site that I am incredibly excited about is Duncastle on the Celtic Sea on the coast of southern Ireland. Um, I'm really excited about that one. It is maybe our newest historic site. That is where Andrew Bolton, when we were there, baptized Adam Coleman, so a new member in Ireland, and relaunching the church in Ireland. And so just an amazing experience. The water was freezing. We were going to try and do it at Hook Head Lighthouse, one of the oldest lighthouses in the world, but the seas were raging. It was not a promising place to go in the water. So we found some calmer water. Andrew was brave enough to go in. Just really, really an exciting time and a new historic site.
That's awesome. It's great that you're experiencing church history, writing church history, as well as going to some of the older sites. I hope you're documenting all of this, and I hope you'll keep us in the loop and the more you learn.
Lots of photos, lots and lots of photos.
Well, speaking of church history, I'm going to turn the spotlight over to you because we are all ready to hear your thoughts on Nauvoo Polygamy and the RLDS Church.
All right, here we go. I'm here to talk about Nauvoo polygamy, which is not a passionate topic for me, but something that I have encountered regularly through the last 30 years. And there's been increasing discussion about polygamy and what it might have looked like early on and who was involved. And I think that's what was behind the invitation for me to come and talk a little bit about how the RLDS Church has responded to polygamy through the years. And it's been a story of evolution. So let me start with a few notes on vocabulary. So as we talk about polygamy, that's the practice of having more than one wife or husband at the same time. Polygyny is having more than one wife at a time. Polyandry, having more than one husband at a time. Plural marriage, a marriage in which there is more than one husband or wife. Celestial, or also known as eternal marriage, a marriage believed to last beyond death and into eternity. Sealing, a term I'll use occasionally tonight, a ceremony believed to bind people together for life and after death. And spiritual wife is a woman sealed to a man for eternity. Some of these things, for example, celestial marriage, eternal marriage, sealing, not part of Community of Christ, but survive in other traditions like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Just full transparency, I want you to know where I'm coming from. I am informed by Community of Christ church history principles. So my understanding is that history informs, but does not dictate our faith. In Community of Christ, we support and encourage honest, responsible historical scholarship, and we are cautioned to do our best to avoid presentism, which is the tendency to view the past through the lens of the present. That's not fair to the people who have gone before. It's also really hard not to engage in presentism, but we need to do our best to overcome it. Seeing both the faithfulness and mistakes in our history makes it more believable, not less. We don't legislate or mandate positions on matters of church history. I'm confident some of you tonight are going to land in a different place than I do on some of the things we'll talk about, and that's fine. It's important to create and maintain a respectful culture of dialogue that allows different points of view on history. So we might disagree, but we will disagree respectfully. Some context. A scholar by the name of Larry Foster a number of years ago put a book out called Religion and Sexuality, 3 American Communal Experiences of the 19th Century. And he explored the relationship between questions about sexuality and the nature of family, the nature of human relationships, and communitarianism. We're, of course, part of that early 19th century movement of communitarian groups. And very often for these groups, questions about sexuality worked their way into the mix. So, for example, Shakers addressed sexuality by choosing celibacy. The Rappites in Economy, Pennsylvania, another expression of a communitarian group around us who chose celibacy. The Oneida community in upstate New York had a different approach. They practiced complex marriage, where everybody was married to everybody else. And of course, with Latter-day Saints, there's the introduction of plural marriage or polygamy in 1840s Nauvoo. So there's something about living in community that seemed to raise questions about the nature of human relationship at that time. And I would argue that that is not the only time that has happened. There's something about social upheaval that raises questions about the nature of family and the nature of relationship. So whether it's the 1820s and 30s or the 1960s or even the last 15 years, as society is in turmoil and there's lots of rapid change, people ask questions about the way that we should be in community together and the way that we might partner. Some challenges in reconstructing the story of plural marriage in Nauvoo. One is that monogamy was the law of the church throughout Joseph Smith Jr.'s life. 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, section 101, which is now 111 in Community of Christ, that was removed in the LDS tradition in 1876 and replaced by what is now section 132. But section 111, 4b, we believe that one man should have one wife and one woman, but one husband, except in case of death. Other examples, February 31, D&C 42, thou shalt love thy wife with all thy heart and shalt cleave unto her and none else. Or March of 31, section 49, it is lawful that a man should have one wife and they twain shall be one flesh. So again, monogamy, the law of the church throughout Joseph Smith Jr.'s life. Polygamy was publicly denounced and denied throughout the 1830s and 40s. As a result, plural marriage or polygamy is very rarely discussed in diaries and journals at the time. And even then, on the rare occasion when it does make it in, it's often in code. Sometimes it seems to be Masonic. So for example, SAW for sealed and wed, or WAS for wedded and sealed. Sometimes it's shorthand. Things like ME for marriage for eternity, or MT, apparently marriage for time. Also, some sources were edited or changed when published. So for example, from the Joseph Smith / Willard Richards journal entry for 5 October 43, this is Joseph, gave instruction to try those who were preaching, teaching, or, and then crossed out, practicing the doctrine of plurality of wives on this law. Joseph forbids it and the practice thereof. No man shall have but one wife. When that later made it into an LDS church history, it has evolved a bit. Gave instructions to try those persons who were preaching, teaching, or practicing the doctrine of plurality of wives. For according to the law, I hold the keys of this power in the last days, for there is never but one on earth at a time on whom the power and its keys are conferred. And I have constantly said, no man shall have but one wife at a time, unless the Lord directs otherwise. So we all got very suspicious about sources pretty early because of some of the editing that took place. Also, after about 1860, many of the participants in the discussion were so passionate about the position that they held that they struggled to overcome their biases. So I'm often a little nervous when I'm looking at later sources. Most source material on the topic of polygamy is generated decades after the events occurred, ironically, in response to Joseph Smith III's attempt to clear his father's name. Some people would say, oh, yes, he did do that. And then they would go to the courthouse and put together an affidavit with what they believed. As a result, though, because they're decades after the fact, many sources are susceptible to being discredited due to mistakes in memory or to conflicting statements made by the same individuals in the 1840s. So they might have said something in the 1840s that contradicted what they said decades later. Why was polygamy introduced? Um, it's speculative, but scholars have speculated that it could have something to do with the fact that Joseph and the church was all about a restoration of all things. So we are restorationists trying to restore. So Abraham, David, Jacob, Solomon, all practicing plural marriage or polygamy or concubines. Why polygamy? Perhaps to raise up a righteous seed. These numbers are probably outdated, definitely outdated by now, but as of 2020, Joseph and Emma had something like 1,600 descendants. Their children did not practice polygamy. Hiram Smith, some of whose children were practicing polygamy in the West, as of 2020, something like 18,000 descendants. So for the male, you have the opportunity to have a lot more descendants. And Section 132 says the point is to raise up a righteous seed. You see that it worked. Why polygamy? Another argument is that it's an extension of eternal marriage, which is introduced during the Nauvoo period. So Jacob Scott Sr. writes to Mary Warnock on 5 January of 44. I think this is his daughter. Many members of the church have already availed themselves of this privilege. He's talking about eternal marriage being sealed together and have been married to their deceased partners. And in some cases where a man has been married to 2 or 3 wives and they are dead, he has been married to them all in the order in which he was married to them while living. So this theory says that if suddenly plural marriage is okay in heaven, then it must be okay on earth. Another possible reason, this concept of dynastic polygamy. Samuel Brown, in his really important work, it's called In Heaven as It Is on Earth, explores the concept of dynastic polygamy and kind of puts into context some of the things that Joseph was doing with the intent to keep families together, to keep the church community together. So baptism for the dead by proxy, sealings of husbands and wives and families, and even strategic plural marriages among leading families of the church, kind of like royal families in Europe used to strategically marry their kids off to build these coalitions or these partners. So this idea of dynastic polygamy, defeating death by these strategic partnerships, these strategic marriages. A brief history of Nauvoo polygamy. First plural marriage, likely Joseph Smith Jr. and Louisa Beeman in April of 1841. On 12 July of 43, Joseph apparently dictates what would later, 1876, become LDS Doctrine and Covenants section 132 on eternal and plural marriage. William Clayton is one of the very few people in 1840s Nauvoo who's actually writing about this, and he describes this as Hiram, who's opposed to plural marriage, but saying if Joseph would only have a revelation, that he'd believe it, and believing that he could convince Emma of its correctness if Joseph would have a revelation on it. So there's evidence to suggest that the only reason 132 is written down is to convince Emma that plural marriage was correct. According to Clayton, Joseph dictates. The scribe writes this down, hands it to Hiram. You see a picture of the Joseph's office in the red brick store. This is likely where this event took place, hands the document to Hiram, who heads off to visit Emma, who's likely in the homestead at the time. Hiram quickly returns and says, "I have never had a worse talking to in all my life." So he was not able to convince Emma with that document. Participants in plural marriage prior to Joseph Smith Jr.'s death. Of course, Joseph killed June 27 of 44. This is based on the work of George D. Smith in a book called Nauvoo Polygamy, but we called it celestial marriage. According to Smith's research, George Smith's research, about 33 men and 91 women were participating in plural marriage prior to Joseph's death. There's probably 11,500 people living in Nauvoo, maybe close to 20,000 Latter-day Saints in the Nauvoo area. So a very small percentage of participants. Participation peaked in 1843 and then fell off dramatically in 1844. And Joseph isn't believed to have taken additional wives after the fall of 43. So, and what we're really here to talk about, the RLDS Church's response to polygamy. I'm going to be drawing heavily on the work of Richard Howard and his Changing RLDS Response to Mormon Polygamy, a preliminary analysis from 1983, and Alma Blair and his RLDS Views of Polygamy, some historiographical notes from 1985. So, as Alma points out, the RLDS response to polygamy was always antagonistic, consistently antagonistic towards polygamy, and we believed it to be immoral. But the question of Joseph's role in the introduction of plural marriage, we are not consistent on that question. That evolved through the years. So early on, we believed, or at least many did, that Joseph was involved, but that he repented and we should forgive him. That's about 1850 to 1870. William Marks dies. We'll talk more about William quite a bit more. And we evolve into Joseph didn't do it, Brigham Young did. Brigham did it 1870 to 1960. That's where many of us are. It evolves again with the coming of New Mormon history, the kind of professionalization of church history. And it moved into something like Joseph might have done it as an unintended theological consequence of eternal marriage. So that's based on the Scott Warnock letter we talked about earlier, where there's eternal marriages. So plural marriage in the hereafter must be okay here and now. And then beginning probably mid 80s, and these are not definitive lines, but with the New Mormon history, with the professionalization of church history, more and more leaders and members started to move into an idea that Joseph did it, or that Joseph did it, but that he repented. I probably should update this slide because there's also many people now who are from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints background who now believe Joseph didn't do it. I don't know that they realize it, but they're bumping into the work pioneered by Richard Price. Joseph Smith Fought Polygamy. And that is having a pretty significant impact on members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And sometimes that crosses over into members of Community of Christ and Restorationist branches as well. So let's look at each of these periods. I'm going to run through some sources that suggest that Joseph was involved, but that he repented. So here is one. This is the last meeting of the Nauvoo Relief Society, so the minutes. And they're talking about the Voice of Innocence, which was a document put together basically denouncing immorality in Nauvoo and encouraging the church members to live virtuously and righteously. So the Voice of Innocence was then read and approved. Emma continued further by exhorting all to take heed to their ways and follow teachings of Brother Joseph. And when he preaches against vice, to take heed to it. So it's saying what he says publicly, you should listen to. And said he meant what he said, concluded her remarks by requesting all to use their common senses, and they would teach us right principles if we would adhere to them. Further, that we must be willing to forgive what is past in consideration of repentance and reformation. So clearly this is not specifically saying I'm talking about Joseph and polygamy, but they are talking about the Voice of Innocence and then about what Joseph is teaching about it. So I believe this is a source that says Joseph, we should forgive him. Listen to what he says publicly. He's given it up. We should forgive him. Another one is Hiram Smith, who visits William Law. So this is William Law's diary. Hiram Smith was here a few days ago, or his journal. He said they were not doing anything in the plurality of life business now, and that he had published a piece against it. So that's 19 March of 1844. William wanted Hiram and Joseph to publicly admit it. They didn't want to publicly admit it, and so William went ahead and published his expositor dissenting newspaper. So Hiram's saying, I've published something in the Times and Seasons. When you go and look, sure enough, just a few days earlier, this is the Times and Seasons, 15 March of 44. There is no such doctrine, they're talking about plurality of wives, taught here, neither is there any such thing practiced here. And any man that is found teaching privately or publicly any such doctrine is culpable and will stand a chance to be brought before the High Council and lose his license and membership. Here's another one. This is Isaac Sheen, early church leader. Joseph Smith repented of his connection with this, talking about spiritual wife, again, plural marriage or polygamy doctrine, and said that it was of the devil. That's the Saturday Evening Post, 9 October of 52, later reprinted in the first edition of the Saints Herald. Here's William Marks, who we'll spend a lot of time on. He was the stake president in 1840s Nauvoo. William says, Joseph, however, became convinced before his death that he had done wrong. He, Joseph, said, this doctrine of polygamy or spiritual life system that has been taught and practiced among us will prove our destruction and overthrow. I have been deceived, said he, in reference to its practice. It is wrong. It is a curse to mankind, and we shall have to leave the United States soon unless it can be put down and its practice stopped in the church. So that's 1853. William Marks and Sheen, this is a letter from Marks to Sheen in 59. It also makes it into the first edition of the Saints Herald. He, Joseph, said it eventually would prove the overthrow of the church, and we should soon be obliged to leave the United States unless it could be speedily put down. He was satisfied that it was a cursed doctrine and that there must be every exertion made to put it down. This one is the Council of 12 Minutes. It's 1 or 2 May 1865. This is the RLDS Council of 12. The question arose as to whether Joseph the martyr taught the doctrine of polygamy. President Mark said Brother Hiram came to his place once and told him he did not believe in it, and he was going to see Joseph about it, and if he had a revelation on the subject, he would believe it. And after that, Hiram read a revelation on it in the High Council, and he, Marks, felt that it was not true, but he saw the High Council received it. Here's another one, 1 October of 65, Marks to Hiram Falk and Josiah Butterfield. He, Joseph, said this polygamy business in the church must be stopped or the church is ruined, and we can't stay in the United States. I have been deceived in this thing, and it must be put down. I thought it would be an advantage to mankind, but I find it proves a curse. This one's Brigham Young, 8 October of 66. Joseph was worn out with it, but as to his denying any such thing, I never knew that he denied the doctrine of polygamy. Some have said that he did, but I do not believe he ever did. By 1867, the Council of 12 is meeting in near Keokuk in Nauvoo, and they're passing resolutions like this one. Resolved that a persistent belief in the doctrines of polygamy, sealing, marrying for eternity, or spiritual wifery shall be considered as heretical, and the persons so holding to such doctrines subject themselves to suspicion of apostasy, and such persons, if found advocating those or any of those doctrines, should be labored with, and if they refuse to conform to the rule prescribing by the body respecting the teaching or advocating heresy, publicly or privately, they are in danger of the council as not being in the possession of the Spirit of God. We put up together another one at about the same time. At a council meeting of some of the general authorities of the church held at Nauvoo, Illinois, April 3, 4, and 5, 1867, the following resolution was passed. Resolved that any official member of the church who shall, in public or private, official member means priesthood, in public or private, endorse, teach, or encourage, either directly or indirectly, the doctrines of polygamy, spiritual wifery, or marrying for eternity, shall be silenced, and if he does not repent of the evil, he should be cut off. I find it really interesting. So the spring conference, this general conference of the church, was being held in Keokuk, Iowa. So just before that conference, members of the 12 met with the presidency in Nauvoo. And that council meeting was held upstairs in the red brick store. So the very building and on the very floor where apparently Section 132 was dictated in 1843, here it is 1867, and the RLDS leaders are meeting in the same space and making it clear that they want nothing to do with plural marriage, nothing to do with polygamy. Here's another one. This is Mark Forskett. In speaking of polygamy, he, William Marks, said, near 2 weeks before Joseph was killed, he told me that I was the only one of the authorities of the church not in polygamy, that polygamy was an evil and that in it he had been deceived. There's multiple sources where Mark Forskett is quoting William Marks. There's also other Smith family members saying similar things. The more I look, and I don't look hard, it's not something I focus a lot on, but the more I look on this topic, the more sources I am finding, many from Marx, but not all, that have Joseph in some way involved, but prior to his death, deciding it was a mistake and trying to get it stopped. Here's what Joseph's youngest son, David Hiram Smith, so David born after his father was killed, but here's what he said. When I was with you before, I did not know as much as I do now in regard to my father's life. Even if he did wrong, he repented and told the saints that polygamy was a false and wicked doctrine. Here's William Marks to John Hawley. This is kind of a long one. I'm going to read it from another source. So he's recalling this in 1885, but it's a discussion that happened in July of 1868. When the conversation came up between us, so this is John Hawley and William Marks, on the subject of the revelation of 1843 on polygamy, he told me that he knew the very day that the revelation was given. He said one morning Brother Hiram was walking down the street pretty fast, and he, Marks, hailed him and said, Brother Hiram, which way? He told me he was going down to Joseph's and we were going to get a revelation on patriarchal marriage today if we can. In the evening, he came along back and handed him the revelation and asked him to call the High Council together and read it to them. And said Marks, I did so and asked them to express their belief or disbelief of it. The High Council all said they believed it to be of God, but he did not. From that time on, he said the leading men of the church looked upon him, Marks, as on the eve of apostasy. But times went on till Joseph saw it would be the means of the destruction of the church. And he came to me and said, Brother Marks, I wish to talk with you on the subject of the revelation of polygamy. We have got to put this revelation down, or it will be the means of the destruction of the church. And said he, you must go in the High Council, Marks the president of the High Council, and I will prefer charges against all that have gone into polygamy. And if they do not repent, you must cut them off. But I, Marks, said to him, Joseph, Brother Joseph, it is not my place, and I refuse to obey his counsel. And he, Mark, said this was the first counsel that Joseph gave to me that I refused to obey. I told him that he was the one to put it down, as he was the one it was given through. Some time elapsed when he came to me the second time and told me the church would go to destruction if we did not put it down, and we must proclaim against it. Some more time passed, and I met Joseph on the beach of the river, and here we had our third talk on this revelation. He told me that this wicked practice had gone too far to try and put a stop to it, and I must now give my life for this revelation. I am now going to Carthage and deliver myself up to the slaughter. This is Brother Mark's testimony to me as near as I can remember, John Hawley. There's, again, a number of sources that also have Joseph saying something like that. I've unleashed this revelation on the church. I, I can't fix it. I'm going to have to go and turn myself into Carthage. Interesting stuff. Okay, so then we start moving into moving from Joseph did it, but he repented, we should forgive him, to the Joseph didn't do it period. This correlates pretty closely with William Marks's death. So you have Emma's last testimony in 1879 that occurred in a bedroom in the Riverside Mansion or Nauvoo House. You see a picture there. In his last testimony question, this is Joseph III asking his bond questions. Did he, meaning Joseph, did not have other wives than yourself? Answer, he had no other wife but me, nor did he, to my knowledge, ever have. Also during this time, statements by William Marks quoting Joseph as having been deceived about polygamy began to be reinterpreted. So Marx is dead now. They began to be reinterpreted to mean that Joseph had been deceived by others. Not that Joseph was deceived about polygamy, that others had deceived Joseph and secretly introduced polygamy and that Joseph was not involved. This is Joseph III writing to his uncle, William Smith. William was going to be giving an interview about for a book, and Joseph III was a little nervous. I have long been engaged in removing from fathers' memory and from the early church the stigma and blame thrown upon them because of polygamy, and have at last lived to see the cloud rapidly lifting. And I would not consent to see further blame attached by a blunder now. Therefore, uncle, bear in mind our standing today before the world as defenders of Mormonism free from polygamy, and go ahead with your personal recollection of Joseph and Hiram. A few minutes on polygamy and RLDS converts in Utah. So tragically, some, like Alexander Williams, who I believe you see here, some of the folks who RLDS missionaries converted in early Utah decided to move back to the Midwest, and some of them left plural families behind in Utah. Others apparently brought plural families back with them to the Midwest, and they cared for those families, but they did not live with them as husband and wife. I don't want to spend a lot of time on these, but we spent a lot of time with General Conference resolutions about polygamy. So this one, 1863, that the members and ministry avoid alluding to or discussing the subject of polygamy when it is not imperatively necessary. 1870, this conference do appoint a committee of 5 to draft and present before this conference shall adjourn a memorial to Congress, which shall be embodied in our epitome of faith, and especially a setting forth of our views on government, church, polity, and polygamy. The finished product was 8 pages long, talking about how RLDS members are not polygamists. 1876, we encouraged Congress to take more decisive measures in the suppression of alleged misrule and tyranny in Utah, and again clarified that the RLDS Church was not involved in polygamy. 1882 offered thanks to President Chester A. Arthur and others for the passage of the Edmunds Bill, which was an attempt to squash polygamy. 1882 requested the U.S. Secretary of State William Evarts to, quote, correct his error and clarify that RLDS members were not polygamists and should be allowed to immigrate to the U.S. He refused our request and argued that law-abiding immigrants are secure against interference. 1902, a statement in support of a constitutional amendment prohibiting the practice of polygamy in all U.S. states and territories. 1903, reaffirmed the Church's support for a constitutional amendment prohibiting the practice of polygamy in all U.S. states and territories. By the 1940s, Fawn Brody and Israel A. Smith end up in an epic battle. Fawn had not been particularly welcomed into the archives of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake. We, under Israel, were pretty welcoming early on, and were dismayed when her finished product came out, No Man Knows My History, The Life of Joseph Smith. Israel prepared to file a lawsuit, wrote to the publisher threatening a lawsuit. He was particularly annoyed that she told the story of Emma pushing Eliza R. Snow down the stairs and that Eliza had a miscarriage as a result. Really annoyed about that story. And I actually agree with Israel that I think that one historically doesn't hold up very well at all. But okay, then by the 60s, again, we're starting to move into the New Mormon history period. So starting to consider that Joseph might have been involved and that polygamy perhaps grew out of this eternal marriage principle. So you could be married eternally to more than one spouse. It's okay in heaven, must be okay on earth. So Charles Davies, who was one of our historians, Morris Draper, Richard Howard, can land on this position. I think, though, Dick likely didn't really want to land on this position, but probably got encouraged by the presidency that this was as far as he could go. Um, Polygamists and baptism in the RLDS church. If you're not picking up on it, let me be clear that we've spent much of our existence battling polygamy. We spent a lot of energy on the topic. But in the 1960s, as we were moving into places like India, where polygamy was being practiced, it was part of the culture in some tribal areas. We ran into the question of, do we baptize polygamists? These are people who are not Christian, who are introduced to Christianity, and they want to join, and we are baptizing them, but it becomes very controversial. We end up with a policy where we would baptize somebody who was a polygamist as long as they agreed to not take more wives and to raise their children as monogamous. We knew that to require them to cast off plural wives was a death sentence in those cultures, and we didn't think that was Christian. And so I'm kind of stunned, though, that we came to that position. So this is 1972, section 150 of the Doctrine and Covenants, W. Wallace Smith. The church must be willing to bear the burden of their sin, as we put it at that time. And so again, we would knowingly baptize polygamists as long as they agreed not to take more spouses and to raise their children to be monogamous. And it's worked, but also the larger culture has shifted against polygamy in a number of these places as well. More recently, probably even more into the Joseph did it, or back actually to the Joseph did it but repented. I think that a number of the scholars in Community of Christ would probably be either on the Joseph did it position or that Joseph did it but repented. But you'll also find members who think that Joseph was never involved, that Brigham did it. Here's an interesting old argument revived. So if Joseph was involved in plural marriage, where are the children? Something that has been debated for generations. So what did polygamy in Nauvoo look like? So not only did men have multiple wives, they were sealed to multiple wives. Let me be clear that they did not live publicly with them, and that throughout the Nauvoo period, we're denouncing and denying the practice. So it's not being lived publicly, but some men, not very many, we saw 33 men in Nauvoo prior to Joseph's death, had more than one wife, but some women also were sealed to more than one husband. So what that meant is that if there was a child, um, it wasn't necessarily clear whose child or who was the father. A number of these relationships, I believe, were not physical; they were spiritual only, but some of them were physical. So the Sorensen Molecular Genealogy Foundation and a good friend, Ugo Perigo, started a study on the Smith family DNA decades ago. So they're soliciting genetic material from the Smith family. As they were doing that, though, they started having people come forward who were saying things like, well, we're not Smiths, we're Pratts, but we know that we're really Joseph Smith's descendants. Now, these guys are geneticists, not historians, and so they decided to run it. And they were going to announce their findings at a Smith family reunion in Nauvoo. And the discussion of plural marriage was pretty sensitive for members of the Church of Jesus Christ as well as members of Community of Christ. It's not something people really wanted to talk about. But Ugo was presenting his findings. He'd done the study on the Buells and the Pratts. Some of these were not good candidates to be Joseph's children or descendants, but some of them were the best candidates. And so the Buells, not Smiths, the Pratts. Ugo said, well, we've done the research and they're not Smiths. Of course, the next question is, are they even Pratts? He's got a fun sense of humor, and they were Pratts. Um, when the project started, you could only do the testing if the child was male. The technology was not there for female children and their descendants. It now is, and several years back, um, Ugo ran the family of Josephina Lyon, who had been told by her mom on her mother's deathbed that she was really Joseph's child. Um, they've done the work, and they're not Smiths. They're not Joseph's descendants. So, to this point, there's no genetic evidence that Joseph had children from other than Emma, which makes me wonder about the nature of the plural relationship. Again, I think some of them are physical. I think others are not, but you would expect, I would expect, if the point of plural marriage is to raise up a righteous seed, that there should be children. And at this point, that there doesn't seem to be. All right, I've talked quite a bit. I'm going to stop there, and I'll stop the share.
Thank you, Locke. That was a lot of information to take in a short period of time. Um, Thank you all for hanging in there. And thank you, Locke, for giving us a lot to think about tonight. You've given us great perspective. And I think in many ways, by exploring the evidence that's out there, that's led us to a lot of answers and a lot of questions. So I think there's a number of new homework assignments that we have tonight. Before we close out the evening, are there any last few words you'd like to share with the group before we call it a night?
Well, thank you for taking it easy on me. I was worried how this would go, and I don't know yet. I've not been. I can't see the chat, so
There's a lot of love for you out there in the chats. So
okay.
thank you for that. Also, a big thank you to Wendy for helping out behind the scenes and for Peter, all of your help tonight. You two continue to make it look so easy. And last we share our thanks to all of you, our dear friends in the audience. Thank you for your love of a good story and for generously supporting the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. We really appreciate you. Now, I encourage all of you to tune in next Thursday, November 13th, as we welcome our friend Seth Bryant to the Autumn Lecture Series. Seth will explore local politics here in 1830s Kirtland. Disenfranchisement was a function of township government in Ohio and could be used to protect funds and politics from those who were seen as unfit by local leaders. In Kirtland, the early church members' peculiar religion and differing political views were the major reason why they were denied residency and its subsequent rights. Eventually, the saints made inroads into township politics and even voted their own into office, but not without challenges and negotiations. So join us next week as we explore some of those challenges and negotiations with Seth Bryant. Wendy will drop the link into the chats where you can register for next Thursday's program at 7 p.m. So until then, keep reading your church history, friends, and have a blessed night. Thanks again.